When he retreats into silence, is he protecting you or protecting himself from you? And more importantly, why does that silence echo so loudly inside you? There's a particular kind of stillness in relationships that doesn't soothe, but stings. A quiet that isn't peaceful, but piercing. It's the message he never says, the reply that never comes, the emotional presence that suddenly vanishes. And in that void, your mind starts to run. Did I do something wrong? Is he pulling away? Why won't he just say what he's feeling? This video is not about blaming men or women. It's about decoding a behavioral language that many of us were never taught to understand, the language of silence, especially when that silence isn't mutual, but unilateral, when he shuts down, disconnects, vanishes emotionally, and leaves you carrying the weight of the emotional atmosphere. If you've ever found yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, begging for a conversation, or trying to decipher what his quietness really means, then this isn't just his silence we're talking about. It's the old wound of emotional abandonment that echoes from much earlier in life. It's the moment when love starts to feel conditional, earned, precarious. And yet, here's the truth that many women never hear. His silence often says more about him than it does about you. But if you've been conditioned to interpret distance as your failure, then his withdrawal doesn't feel neutral. It feels like a threat. Before we decode what his silence might mean, we need to understand why your nervous system reacts so strongly to it. Because emotional silence is never just about now, it's a trigger that touches every moment in your past where connection was interrupted, or love was withheld until you performed perfectly. So this is not a lesson in learning to tolerate silence. It's a journey to understand it, to see it not as an accusation against you, but as a mirror of his internal conflict. From Freud's theory of defense mechanisms to the deeply socialized patterns of emotional suppression in men, we're going to open this quiet door and see what actually lives behind it. But first, let's explore Freud's insight into the unconscious language of withdrawal and why silence, so often, is a defense, a protection, and sometimes a mask. To understand the silence that suddenly appears in a man's behavior, we must step beyond the surface. Silence is not always peaceful. In the Freudian view, silence can be an elaborate form of psychological defense. Not a conscious strategy, but an unconscious reflex. It's not necessarily manipulative. Often it's protective, even primitive. Freud called these patterns defense mechanisms, the mind's automatic ways of protecting itself from pain, conflict, or inner chaos. One of the most common and least discussed is withdrawal, emotional retreat, disengagement. In relationships, this doesn't always come with drama. Sometimes it comes with nothing at all, just quiet, just distance. And in that silence, the other person, often the woman, is left scrambling to interpret, soothe, or fix. But let's step back. Where does this withdrawal begin? In childhood, a boy learns quickly what kinds of emotional expressions are acceptable and which ones are punished. If sadness makes the father uncomfortable, the boy may stop expressing sadness. If fear provokes shame or is called weakness, he will learn to suppress it. This emotional pruning isn't done maliciously. It's done through subtle cues, tone, body language, and reinforcement. A raised eyebrow, a mocking tone, a lack of empathy. Eventually, he develops an internal structure, what Freud called the superego, a kind of inner parent. This part of the mind polices thoughts, feelings, and desires according to the rules of the environment. So by the time he's grown, many of his emotional responses are not free, they're censored, managed, hidden even from himself. So what does this have to do with silence? A man who hasn't developed the emotional vocabulary to face conflict, fear, or relational vulnerability will not say, "I feel overwhelmed and ashamed, and I don't know how to talk about it." Instead, he may just disappear, not physically, but emotionally. He may feel the heat of confrontation and withdraw, not out of strategy, but from emotional paralysis. He may feel desire and fear coexisting, a longing for closeness, but a terror of losing himself in it. Silence becomes his unconscious way of managing this contradiction. And here's where it becomes deeply confusing for you. Because when someone withdraws without explanation, your own early emotional scripts get activated, especially if you were raised in an environment where connection was unpredictable, love was conditional, or emotional availability was rare. You don't just experience his silence, you experience every silence you've ever been wounded by. Freud also taught that human behavior is rarely about what it appears to be. Silence may look like indifference, but it can also be loaded with anxiety, guilt, or fear of inadequacy. A man may go quiet not because he doesn't care, but because caring too much terrifies him, or because he fears being exposed, emotionally naked, and hasn't learned how to stand in that vulnerability without shame. There's also another dynamic that Freud hinted at, the concept of repetition compulsion. This is when a person unconsciously repeats past relational patterns, hoping for a different outcome. A man who grew up with emotionally distant caregivers may now seek closeness, but sabotage it with silence when it feels too real, because real connection is both what he craves and fears most. This is why so many women feel confused. He said he cared. He said he wanted closeness. So why did he vanish when I opened up? Because the unconscious doesn't follow logic. It follows reinforcement. And for some men, withdrawal has been reinforced since boyhood as the safest, or only, way to survive emotional discomfort. Freud would likely interpret a man's sudden silence not as a calculated punishment, but as an unresolved conflict between his desire and his defense, between his wish to be seen and his terror of being known, between the child in him who was never emotionally mirrored and the adult who now doesn't know how to stay present when feelings intensify. But here's the warning. Just because his silence is unconscious doesn't mean you have to accept it without boundaries. Understanding behavior doesn't mean excusing its consequences. So how does this Freudian lens connect with the world you're living in now, the culture that shaped him, and the emotional roles that men are expected to play? To answer that, we need to leave the psychoanalytic office and walk into the real world of modern masculinity, where boys are still taught to shut up, toughen up, and never ever fall apart. To understand male silence today, we must explore not just the man, but the mold he was poured into, the mold of modern masculinity, the one that teaches him how to be strong, how to be desirable, how to be acceptable in a society that still treats emotional expression in men as a weakness rather than a human truth. What does he learn as a boy? Don't cry, don't talk too much, don't be soft, control yourself, get over it, and above all, never show that you're afraid. These aren't just passing comments, they are behavioral instructions, reinforced again and again by fathers, coaches, teachers, and even sometimes by mothers, who themselves were shaped by generations of emotional repression and survival logic. What begins as emotional advice becomes internal law. Boys learn not to speak their emotional truth, but to perform emotional control. So by the time he's a man in a relationship, he may no longer know what he feels, only what he's supposed to feel. The rest gets locked away. That grief from his first heartbreak, buried. That fear of not being enough, masked with sarcasm or silence. That shame about being vulnerable, transformed into withdrawal. And here is the paradox. He wants intimacy, but he was never taught how to stay in it when it becomes emotionally complex. He desires closeness, but closeness exposes him, and exposure, in his world, equals weakness. This is not just personal, it's cultural. We live in a society where men are allowed to show confidence but not confusion, anger but not sadness, desire but not dependency. They are expected to perform certainty even when they are deeply conflicted. So when relational challenges arise, when you express a need, when you touch a raw nerve, when you invite depth, he may fall into the only response he's practiced since boyhood, withdrawal. But here's the brutal irony. This silence isn't about power. It's often about protection. Because in his inner world, emotional exposure feels like risk, and risk feels like danger. He may not even know he's doing it. That's what conditioning does. It turns emotional avoidance into instinct. Silence becomes his armor. He doesn't need to process, doesn't need to justify, he just retreats. Disengages, maybe for hours, maybe for days. And you're left wondering what you did wrong, when in truth, you may have simply touched a place inside him that he doesn't know how to name. Let's be very clear. This is not about excusing behavior. It's about understanding reinforcement. In behavior science, what is not punished is often repeated, and what is consistently reinforced becomes automatic. For many men, emotional withdrawal has never been challenged because society rewards their stoicism, their stillness, their control. But what no one tells them, and what women often suffer from, is that silence has a cost. The cost is emotional erosion. The cost is intimacy that dies not from shouting, but from absence. The cost is a partner who begins to question her value because no one told her that his silence has nothing to do with her worth. When Freud spoke of the unconscious, he wasn't just referring to dreams or repressed desires. He meant the whole invisible structure behind our behaviors, the history we carry in silence. And in this modern version of masculinity, that silence is still taught as strength. But in truth, it's often a form of emotional illiteracy. And you, as a woman, are not responsible for translating his silence into sentences. You are not required to shape yourself smaller just to avoid triggering his shutdown. But by understanding where that shutdown comes from, you can stop blaming yourself for a wound you did not create. And yet, you're still in the relationship. You still have to face the silence. So what does it mean? What is he thinking in those quiet moments when words are absent and presence feels withdrawn? Let's move toward that question, not with desperation, but with discernment. When a man goes quiet, it's easy to assume the worst, that he's pulling away, that he's no longer interested, that love is slipping silently through your fingers. But what if his silence isn't a sign of rejection, but confusion? What if he's not withholding affection, but caught in an internal storm he never learned how to name? Let's be clear, not all silence is the same, and not all withdrawal means emotional absence. But every silence tells a story, if you know how to listen. In behavioral terms, withdrawal is often a response to internal conflict, not necessarily between you and him, but within himself. A man may go quiet because he's questioning his identity, his desires, his ability to show up. Not because you asked too much, but because something in your intimacy activated parts of him he hasn't reconciled. Sometimes the silence says, I don't know who I am in this relationship anymore. Sometimes it says, I feel like I'm failing you, but I can't face it. And sometimes, tragically, it says, if I speak, I'll have to admit something to myself that I'm not ready to know. Many women interpret silence as punishment, and sometimes it is a form of control, emotional stonewalling, passive aggression, but more often silence is a defense against shame, a retreat into what feels safe, not for you, for him. Men are rarely taught to face emotional contradictions, so when he starts feeling multiple things at once, desire and doubt, closeness and fear, love and resentment, he may choose the path that feels most familiar, shutting down. That way he doesn't have to resolve the tension, he just escapes it. He may not even be aware of how his silence affects you. For many emotionally conditioned men, silence isn't an active decision. It's a default, a way to buy time, a way to avoid conflict, a way to suppress fear without confronting it. But for the woman on the other end of that silence, it doesn't feel like time or safety. It feels like absence, like emotional abandonment, like being left with unanswered questions and the haunting job of filling in the blanks. So what might his withdrawal indicate? He could be experiencing an identity rupture, a moment where he no longer recognizes himself in the emotional space you're co-creating. This happens often when relationships begin to deepen. The intimacy becomes more than romantic. It becomes existential. It asks both people to be seen without masks. For some men, that's intolerable. He could be caught in ambivalence, feeling torn between moving forward and pulling back. Not because he doesn't care, but because care has never felt safe. Love opens him, but opening makes him feel defenseless. He could be practicing avoidant coping, a learned strategy to handle difficult emotions by simply not addressing them. For him, going quiet is not cruel. It's survival. But here's the key. You must learn to distinguish between healthy solitude and emotional detachment. Solitude is intentional. It's communicated. It creates space while preserving connection. Detachment, on the other hand, is a disappearance, a vacuum, a cutting off, often without warning or repair. If he says, I need space to think, and follows through with respect and clarity, That's emotional maturity. If he just disappears, offers no explanation, and expects you to wait, that's not reflection. That's emotional burden shifting. And this is where you reclaim your power. You are not meant to fill in the blanks of someone else's silence. You are not the translator of his emotional illiteracy. Your role is not to guess, fix, or perform emotional gymnastics to get him to open up. That's not love. That's emotional labor, unpaid and unrecognized. What Freud might say here is that silence, when repeated in the absence of awareness, becomes a reenactment of trauma, not a bridge to connection. So ask yourself, are you trying to connect with a man or with his unresolved past? Because no amount of your explaining will substitute for his own inner work, and no volume of your empathy will make him emotionally available if he hasn't chosen to become so. The question isn't, why is he quiet? The question is, why are you waiting for him to speak before you feel whole? And that takes us to something far more vital than decoding his silence. Learning how to stay grounded in your emotional power, even when someone else goes quiet. It begins in that space between his silence and your reaction to it, the way your body tightens, the thoughts that race, the compulsion to do something, reach out, ask again, soothe, apologize, explain. But what if you didn't? What if the greatest power in that moment wasn't in trying to fix the silence, but in witnessing your own? A man's withdrawal can feel like rejection, abandonment, or punishment. But the deeper wound is not his absence. It's the way you have been taught to abandon yourself the moment someone else pulls away. The silence hurts, yes, but what intensifies the pain is the belief that you must chase love, repair disconnection, or prove your worth to stay emotionally safe. This is the legacy of emotional conditioning, not just his, but yours. So how do you stay centered when someone you care about disconnects? You begin by checking in with yourself, before you check in with him. What is this silence activating in you? A fear of being forgotten, a childhood wound where love was unstable, a belief that if you were enough, he wouldn't go quiet. This isn't just self-reflection, it's emotional reprogramming. Because every time you pause instead of pursue, witness instead of chase, ground instead of collapse, your nervous system learns that connection is not dependent on someone else's consistency. It's built in your own. Emotional resilience in the face of silence means creating internal clarity instead of demanding external certainty. You don't need to make ultimatums. You don't need to beg for words. But you do need to set emotional boundaries, not to control his behavior, but to protect your reality. Let's say he goes quiet after a disagreement. No explanation, no follow-up, just silence. A woman still operating under emotional fear might send a series of texts, replay the conversation in her head, and feel crushed with guilt, even if she said nothing wrong. A woman rooted in self-awareness pauses and says inwardly, I see what's happening. His silence is about him. My value hasn't changed. And then, if necessary, she responds not from emotion but from grounded boundary. She might say, I'm open to communication when you're ready, but I won't sit in silence indefinitely. No anger, no accusation, just clarity. This is not detachment. This is emotional maturity. Because here's a difficult truth. Sometimes silence is a form of emotional control, not because he's evil, but because, in his world, being silent gives him back the sense of power he doesn't know how to find through vulnerability. When that happens, you must recognize the moment where your empathy becomes self-betrayal. Because emotional punishment, which includes chronic withdrawal, stonewalling, or disappearing when things get real, is not love. It's avoidance wrapped in closeness. It creates an addictive loop where you're constantly reaching for connection that remains just out of reach. In behavioral psychology, this is called intermittent reinforcement, a cycle where you sometimes receive affection, sometimes don't, and can never predict which it will be. It keeps you hooked. It makes you question your instincts. It trains you to tolerate less than you deserve. So what can you do in real time when he goes quiet? Return to yourself. Write instead of text. Ask, what do I need emotionally that he's not providing? Remind yourself, I am not responsible for managing someone else's discomfort. And most of all, I will not lose myself trying to hold on to someone who can't hold space for me. Because the real work is not about avoiding silence, but about staying intact in its presence. When you stop chasing clarity from those who withhold it, you begin to generate it from within. And that changes everything. So yes, his silence may speak volumes, but so does your response to it. And when your response comes from a place of emotional clarity, the dynamic shifts, not because he's different, but because you are no longer available for emotional confusion disguised as connection. And that brings us to the final truth. Sometimes the silence isn't a test of your patience, it's an invitation to your freedom. There comes a moment in every emotionally complex relationship where you must decide, will I keep waiting for him to speak, or will I begin to listen to myself? You see, silence isn't just what he withholds. It's what echoes in the space you've spent years trying to fill with understanding, second chances, emotional labor, or unconditional patience. But clarity doesn't come from over-analysis. It comes from acceptance, from stepping back, not in coldness but in recognition of truth. His silence reflects his inner world, not your worth. Many women live in a kind of quiet panic when a man goes emotionally distant. It's not always visible. They keep going to work, taking care of others, staying strong. But inside they are spinning, trying to decode texts that never arrive, replaying the last conversation for hidden clues, searching their own memory for something they might have said to cause it. But here's the part you must remember. Silence is not always a question you're meant to answer. Sometimes it is a boundary you are meant to recognize. When he withdraws, it may not mean the end of love, but it is the end of the version of love that required you to prove your lovability through emotional endurance. And when you stop tolerating that, you don't lose him. You find you. This isn't about giving up on connection. It's about giving up on one-sided connection. It's about refusing to shrink yourself into silence just to preserve peace. It's about remembering that being emotionally available doesn't mean being endlessly available for emotional confusion. And yes, love can be messy. People are complex. But when someone's silence consistently leaves you in a state of self-doubt, anxiety, or emotional limbo, that is not a mystery to solve. That is a pattern to interrupt. Because ultimately, your healing doesn't come when he speaks. It comes when you stop waiting to be chosen by someone who disappears, when intimacy begins to require courage. Emotional freedom starts not with control, but with consciousness. Not with fixing others, but with protecting the ground beneath your own feet. If he wants to show up, he will. If he's uncertain, he can take space, but space with clarity, not punishment. And if he goes quiet in moments that demand honesty, presence, and growth, then you get to decide if that's a silence you're still willing to live beside. As Freud might say, the unconscious seeks expression, or it seeks repetition. The question is, are you living in a love story or in a repetition of being unheard? A woman who has reclaimed her emotional clarity no longer fears silence. She uses it. She sits in it. And when necessary, she speaks through it, not to beg for connection but to affirm her own. Because in the end, silence is also a response, and sometimes your greatest healing. So let's end with this. Comment below. How do you usually respond when a partner goes quiet? Do you chase, collapse, retreat, or rise? And if this video offered you insight or a moment of clarity, subscribe for more deep dives into emotional patterns, feminine strength, and the psychology behind relational confusion. You're not difficult. You just stopped settling for less. And that silence, it's not empty. It's where your voice, your real voice, begins.